The first cry came before the baby was even born. It came from a young woman standing on the front steps of the only home she had known for the past 5 years, clutching a torn duffel bag against her swollen belly as the front door slammed shut behind her. Inside that house, the people she had called family had erased her with a single cruel decision. Outside, beneath the harsh afternoon sun, she stood alone, pregnant, penniless, and accused of chasing a dead man's fortune. The heartbreaking truth was that the man she loved had never stopped fighting to return to her, but no one knew he was still alive. If you believe that kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances can change lives, please like this video, leave a comment sharing where you're watching from, share this story with someone who needs encouragement today, and subscribe to our channel so our community can continue bringing you heartfelt stories that remind us love is stronger than despair. Maren Holloway had never imagined that love could disappear so completely in a single afternoon. She had met Rowan Mercer at a volunteer fundraiser in a quiet Oregon town where both had spent weekends repairing old homes for struggling families. Rowan was thoughtful rather than loud, patient instead of flashy, and possessed the rare gift of making everyone around him feel heard. Their relationship grew slowly, rooted in shared values instead of grand promises, and after 3 years together they married in a simple ceremony surrounded by wildflowers, neighbors, and laughter. They dreamed of buying a small farmhouse, raising children, and growing old together with muddy boots by the front door and coffee shared every morning on the porch. Rowan worked as a structural engineer and was sent overseas to supervise emergency bridge reconstruction after a devastating earthquake. The assignment was expected to last only a few months. Before leaving, he kissed Maren's forehead and rested his hand gently over the child they had only recently discovered she was carrying. He promised he would return before the baby's first kick became impossible to miss. Maren smiled through nervous tears, believing that every goodbye ended with another hello. Then the news arrived. A convoy transporting aid workers had been caught in a catastrophic landslide. Several vehicles were buried beneath tons of rock and mud. Communication had been lost. Weeks later, authorities concluded that multiple workers, including Rowan Mercer, had died in the disaster. The search had become too dangerous to continue. Maren's world shattered before the afternoon sunlight had faded from her kitchen floor. She refused to believe Rowan was gone, but grief has a cruel way of exhausting even the strongest hope. She attended a memorial service without a coffin because none had ever been recovered. She stood before an empty space that represented the man she loved while people whispered words that felt hollow against the silence inside her heart. Rowan's parents, Gerald and Judith Mercer, were devastated at first. They embraced Maren, cried beside her, and insisted she remain in their spacious family home until the baby arrived. They assured her she would always belong. For several weeks, that promise seemed genuine. Then something changed. Gerald became obsessed with legal paperwork concerning Rowan's estate. Judith grew increasingly distant, spending hours talking with distant relatives who filled her mind with suspicion. One afternoon a family acquaintance suggested that Maren had conveniently become pregnant shortly before Rowan's disappearance. Another hinted that she would eventually inherit everything Rowan had owned. Tiny seeds of doubt grew into poisonous certainty. Every meal became uncomfortable. Every conversation felt like an interrogation. Maren noticed doors closing when she entered rooms. She found herself eating alone more often than with the family she desperately needed. One bright autumn afternoon, Gerald placed a folder on the dining table. Inside were legal documents requesting that Maren waive any claim to family assets until complicated estate matters were settled. She quietly explained that she had never wanted money. She wanted Rowan. She would have traded every possession on earth simply to hear his voice again. They didn't believe her. Judith's grief had hardened into bitterness. She accused Maren of using Rowan's memory to secure financial comfort. Gerald remained silent, avoiding eye contact while his wife spoke words sharp enough to leave invisible scars that would last a lifetime. When Maren refused to sign papers she didn't fully understand, everything collapsed. Her suitcase was packed for her. The locks were changed before she reached the sidewalk. She stood beneath the bright afternoon sky holding nothing except a few clothes, prenatal vitamins, family photographs, and the wedding ring still resting on her finger. She had $43 in her purse. The baby kicked gently, almost as if reminding her she was not completely alone. For hours she wandered through town, too ashamed to ask for help. She sat on a public park bench while parents pushed strollers past blooming flower beds. The sunlight felt strangely cold despite the warm weather. She wondered how life could continue so normally for everyone else while hers had completely unraveled. Eventually an elderly librarian named Beatrice Lang noticed her sitting motionless for hours. Beatrice recognized Marin from community reading events and quietly invited her inside the library cafe. Without asking painful questions, she bought Marin soup and warm bread. Sometimes compassion begins with someone noticing that another person hasn't smiled all day. Beatrice connected Marin with a local nonprofit that helped expecting mothers find temporary housing. The apartment was tiny, the furniture mismatched, and the refrigerator nearly empty, but it became a place where hope slowly learned to breathe again. Marin found part-time work repairing old books at the library. The income barely covered necessities, yet every restored page reminded her that damaged things could become beautiful once more. Months passed beneath endless daylight routines filled with doctor's appointments, careful budgeting, and quiet determination. She often rested one hand on her growing belly while reading children's stories aloud, imagining Rowan listening somewhere beyond the silence. What no one knew was that Rowan had survived. The landslide had trapped several workers inside a collapsed service tunnel. Injured, unconscious, and without identification after floodwaters swept away personal belongings, Rowan had been evacuated through a chaotic international emergency system. A severe head injury left him unable to remember his name for many months. Doctors called it traumatic retrograde amnesia. He remembered engineering formulas. He remembered childhood songs. He remembered the feeling that someone important was waiting for him. But every attempt to recall her face dissolved into painful fragments. Recovery was painfully slow. Therapists encouraged patience while investigators struggled to identify several patients whose records had been lost during the disaster response. Only after nearly a year did Rowan's memory begin returning in scattered flashes. A wedding ring. Wildflowers. A tiny heartbeat heard during an ultrasound appointment. One afternoon sunlight streamed across the rehabilitation center courtyard as Rowan suddenly remembered the name Marin. The memory struck with such force that he nearly collapsed. Within days, international agencies confirmed his identity. He immediately arranged transportation home. During that same week, Marin gave birth to a healthy daughter she named Elodie, meaning foreign riches, not because of money, but because love itself had become life's greatest treasure. She held her newborn close and whispered stories about the father who had never stopped loving them, even if the world believed otherwise. Life remained difficult. Bills accumulated. Sleep became rare. Exhaustion settled into every muscle. Yet every sunrise brought another chance to keep moving. Elodie grew into a cheerful infant whose laughter filled the small apartment with the kind of joy expensive houses could never purchase. One crisp afternoon nearly 16 months after Rowan had disappeared, Marin pushed Elodie's stroller through the town square after leaving the library. Across the crowded street, a tall man stepped from a taxi carrying a worn duffel bag. He froze. She froze. Neither trusted their own eyes. For one endless heartbeat the entire world seemed to stand still beneath the bright afternoon sun. Then Rowan ran. People turned as he crossed the street with tears streaming down his face. Marin couldn't move. Every impossible hope she had buried suddenly stood before her breathing. When he finally reached her, neither spoke immediately. Some moments become too sacred for words. He simply wrapped his arms around both Marin and the little girl sleeping peacefully inside the stroller. His tears soaked her shoulder. Her tears soaked his jacket. Years of grief dissolved beneath open daylight where everyone could witness the miracle of love refusing to surrender. The reunion spread quickly throughout town. News reached Gerald and Judith within hours. They arrived trembling, expecting celebration. Instead they encountered the crushing weight of their own choices. They watched Rowan kneel beside Elodie's stroller, gently touching the tiny fingers of the daughter he had never met. Then he looked toward his parents. There was no anger in his eyes. Only profound disappointment. He learned everything. How Maren had been accused. How she had been thrown out while carrying his child. How strangers had offered more kindness than his own family. Gerald lowered his head, unable to defend himself. Judith broke into uncontrollable sobs. Grief had blinded them so completely that they had abandoned the very person Rowan had trusted most. Weeks later they asked to visit. Not to demand forgiveness. Simply to apologize. Maren listened quietly while they admitted every painful mistake without excuses. Gerald confessed that fear of losing another piece of his son had transformed into suspicion toward the woman Rowan loved most. Judith admitted that gossip had become easier to believe than love because grief had made her desperate to blame someone. Forgiveness did not arrive instantly. Real healing rarely does. But Rowan reminded everyone that bitterness would only continue the tragedy. Little by little, guarded conversations became shared meals. Shared meals became cautious smiles. Cautious smiles became genuine family moments centered around Elodie, whose innocent laughter reminded every adult that tomorrow always deserves another chance. Years later, Rowan and Maren finally bought the modest farmhouse they had once dreamed about. It wasn't grand. The porch creaked, the fence leaned slightly, and the garden demanded endless work, but every corner overflowed with gratitude earned through unimaginable hardship. Beatrice often visited for afternoon tea and was introduced to every guest as the woman whose simple act of kindness had changed the course of an entire family's future. Maren never forgot that compassion offered at the right moment can become the bridge between despair and hope. As Elodie grew older, she learned the remarkable story of how her parents had survived impossible circumstances, not because life had been fair, but because they refused to let cruelty define them. She learned that true wealth is measured by love freely given, forgiveness courageously chosen, and hope faithfully protected even when every reason to believe seems lost. Before this story ends, we would love to hear from you. Please leave a meaningful comment telling us whether you believe forgiveness makes a family stronger, or whether trust, once broken, can truly be rebuilt. Your thoughts may encourage someone reading through difficult times today. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Remember that one act of compassion can rescue a stranger, one decision to forgive can restore a family, and one unwavering belief in hope can keep love alive long enough for miracles to find their way home.